Welcome to the International Association of Chiefs of Police web recording on body-worn cameras, vulnerable population, and building trust. This presentation was made possible from our Cooperative Agreement grant from the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. I'm Michael Rizzo, Project Manager for the International Association of Chiefs of Police Law Enforcement Leadership Initiative on Violence Against Women. Before I introduce the two speakers for this presentation, I want to provide brief information about the IACP's National Forum on Body-Worn Cameras and Violence Against Women. Much of the information that will be highlighted in this presentation is based on the dialogue and discussions of the multidisciplinary group of subject matter experts who attended that forum event. The goal of the forum was to discuss considerations and develop recommendations that take into account the impact, both negative and positive, of body-worn cameras on victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in order to support law enforcement executives and other criminal justice leaders create, implement, and update body-worn camera programs, policies, and procedures. The main themes that arose from that forum were policy and program development, privacy and safety of agency members and victims, and underserved populations and building trust. A comprehensive compilation of the discussions at the event can be found in the deliberations document found on the IACP website on the webpage listed on this slide. Contact information will be offered at the end of the presentation. Please contact us if you have questions about the forum event, the deliberations document, or information highlighted in this presentation. I am now pleased to introduce the speakers for today's presentation. Major Irene Burks is a decorated officer with the Prince George's County Police Department in Maryland and currently serves as the Assistant Inspector General. Her philosophy of community-oriented policing blends well with her passion for activism and equal rights. Irene volunteers with several city rights organizations, particularly those focused on equality, LGBTQ youth, and transgender rights. She received her Master's of Science in Management from Johns Hopkins University. Irene served in the United States Air Force and is a veteran of Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Michelle Garcia is the Director of the District of Columbia Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, where she provides leadership and coordination of district-funded programs that serve victims, prevent crime, and improve the administration of justice for victims and offenders. Prior to this position, Michelle worked with the Stalking Resource Center of the National Center for Victims of Crime for nearly a decade, serving as the director for over 9 years. She previously served as a program specialist with the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime and has over 20 years of experience working on the local, state, and national level in movements to end stalking, sexual assault, domestic violence, and dating violence. Thank you, Irene and Michelle, for presenting the information. I'll now turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is Michelle Garcia, and it's a pleasure to be with you to discuss this very important topic. And we'd like to thank the IACP for their leadership in this discussion. Today, we're going to be looking at a few specific areas when discussing body-worn cameras. We want to look at the complexities and challenges around developing and implementing body-worn camera programs that are victim-centered, look at how victims in specific populations and communities may be uniquely impacted by law enforcement's use of body-worn cameras, explore multidisciplinary collaborations to creating and implementing body-worn camera programs, identify partnerships to foster and strengthen in order to develop effective programs, and articulate the importance for proactive law enforcement leadership in the development and implementation of victim-centered body-worn camera programs. We know that body-worn camera programs have already been embraced by multiple jurisdictions across the country, and many more are looking to implement these programs. And so we want to start out by talking about some of the benefits and considerations around body-worn camera programs. And with that, I will turn it over to Irene.
Thank you, Michelle. As you stated, many law enforcement agencies and police associations recognize the benefits of body-worn cameras. In the day-to-day operations of policing and with technological advancements such as Wi-Fi and virtual clouds, body-worn cameras are more accessible and being used by more agencies. They are far more cost-effective than they were in past years. And one of the positive things that has come out of body-worn cameras is that it does enhance policing as well as improve community relations. Body-worn cameras tend to solicit different behavior because it increases accountability in looking at the benefits. So not only does it increase accountability with law enforcement, but also with community members who we come in contact with. And when you have increased accountability, it's almost always hand in hand with a reduction of complaints. With a reduction of complaints, that can mean a reduction in settling cases of police misconduct and could save hundreds of thousands of dollars. Other benefits can include establishing a clear record of victims, witnesses, and offenders' statements, as well as documenting on-scene evidence. Officers are very well aware that a scene can be very hectic. In an instant, an officer can go from having an investigatory conversation to a life-threatening situation. Body-worn cameras can capture that particular moment and can assist in getting a better understanding of what happened beyond eyewitness account. Later on, it could also be used as a training aid. It can also be used to document on-scene evidence that may have been overlooked during the investigatory phase, and with the footage, we're always able to go back and take a look and see if there was anything that we missed. When looking at the considerations, if you look at data retention, public disclosure, and cost, those three pieces go hand in hand. When you're talking about data retention, you're looking at how long will the agency be required to retain that data. With public disclosure, to whom will it be released and when? And then as cost, what is the cost going to be not only to the agency to provide that data to anyone who requests it, but what is it going to cost to retain that data so that it is accessible to not only the police department or law enforcement and the community? And there are also privacy concerns. What are some of the privacy concerns, particularly as it relates to marginalized or vulnerable populations? You can have privacy situations such as children or victims of domestic violence, other instances where it's just not in the best interest to have a particular piece of footage released. When looking at marginalized and vulnerable populations, there are many different communities that are considered marginalized or part of a vulnerable population. There's a very significant portion of our community which consists of marginalized or vulnerable populations. Among them are people with mental illness, substance abuse disorders, and other disabilities. Mental illness is not treated today the same as it was 20, 30, even 40 years ago, in that the treatment for mental illness is usually relied upon for the family. The family is not always able to provide the treatment for the person that's afflicted with mental illness. So we're coming in contact as law enforcement more and more with persons with mental illness. The elderly population is a growing population that in the 2010 census, there were more people over age 65 than at any other time a census was conducted. You also have the youth. Youth are oftentimes overlooked and are not necessarily included in discussions about things that affect them or affect the community that they're in. And when you have an economically disadvantaged community, these are people who don't have a seat at the table oftentimes. Therefore, if they are not there to have these discussions about things that affect them, that just goes further into putting them in a disadvantaged situation. Immigrants pose a special challenge because of language barriers, cultural differences. They may be excluded because of their immigrant status within their communities. And there could also be racial and ethnic and cultural differences within those communities. With the gay, lesbian, bi, and transgender community, those communities historically have had tumultuous relationships with law enforcement. There was a lack of sensitivity. They were targeted. They were not necessarily included within the community. So the LGBT community is working, and law enforcement are working towards building and fostering a better relationship than what was previous. The military community, there are two sides to that. You have the military family members that are left stateside, and then you have the military members that are actually deployed or are overseas. And those really should not be overlooked as marginalized or vulnerable populations. With religious and faith-based communities, oftentimes there may be feelings of not feeling included or being a part of the community because of their religious or because of their faith base, and we need to be able to recognize who they are.
In looking at vulnerable populations and the considerations around body-worn cameras and really any law enforcement initiatives, there are several specific areas we want to dive into. And recognizing that given the large number of different types of communities, populations that Irene just spoke to, not every single area we're about to discuss is going to apply to every single marginalized or vulnerable population, and we don't have the capacity to specifically look at any one population and address all the challenges. So we will be talking in generalities about whatever marginalized and vulnerable populations exist in your community. There are some basic considerations and discussions that you want to have. And we also have to acknowledge that these are not often easy conversations or considerations, but they're absolutely necessary if we want to have programs that are effective and that are supported by the communities that we serve. So these include looking at considerations around the historic relationship between law enforcement and the community, looking at issues around bias and prejudice, identifying what some of the existing barriers are or historical barriers have been, and then also thinking about behavioral health issues. So in the past several years, more and more we are engaging in discussions around the historic relationships between law enforcement and the communities in which they serve. And often those relationships have been marked by conflict, marked by mistrust, marked by calls for change and the need to establish better and more effective relationships. Body-worn cameras are an interesting piece of this discussion because, as Irene mentioned, one of the elements and one of the benefits is to increase accountability, both amongst law enforcement and within the community, an opportunity to really try and address some of the specific issues that have been raised around individual interactions between law enforcement and community members, the opportunity to record those and also to use those as training tools, but really having to acknowledge that in different communities, particularly in marginalized communities, the relationship with law enforcement has not always been an easy one, has not always been a smooth one. And we have to look at what is the existing relationship in our community and how might implementing a body-worn camera program affect that. And so really, again, engaging in those conversations. We also want to look at issues around bias and prejudice. More and more conversation and research is being devoted to issues around implicit bias and particularly implicit bias in policing. And this is really important for us to have, again, these conversations. We want to be sure that the ways that we're interacting with marginalized communities isn't based on stereotypes of those communities. And then also for those of us, whether we are in law enforcement or in policy-making positions, have to acknowledge our own privilege and what that means when we're working with marginalized communities, and whether that is a privilege based on race or gender, economic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, knowing that that creates a power differential and being very mindful of that as we have these discussions with the communities we're serving. We also want to think about what barriers are there in place. So many jurisdictions have very diverse communities, often with individuals who have limited English proficiency or no English proficiency. So wanting to look at what are those language barriers, how do we decrease these barriers? We will talk later around community engagement and community input, and we want to be sure that both we are soliciting information from folks who may speak a different language, but also that we're communicating to our communities in the languages of their choice. We want to look if there's any cultural barriers and how specific cultural experiences may also affect the relationship or interaction between a community and law enforcement. What about financial challenges? So that may be access to resources, access to services, accessibility issues, particularly for individuals with disabilities. And then what about minors? So what roles and rights do minors have in our systems? What agency do they have? How will we be engaging with them? And particularly when we think about body-worn cameras, what considerations do we want to have in place around footage involving minors? And then as Irene started talking about, we have to have some considerations around behavioral health issues when we're thinking about body-worn cameras and some of the footage that we may be collecting and how we make that available. So looking at mental health, substance abuse, as well as co-occurring disorders. So all of these are some basic considerations that we want to have when we're looking at body-worn camera policies and programs specific to the vulnerable populations that may exist in our jurisdictions. And like I said when we started, these are often difficult conversations to have, but they're absolutely essential conversations to have. And they're the type of conversations that as we engage our community can really build trust between our communities and law enforcement. And so we want to look at some ways in which we can actually engage in community trust building.
So how do agencies move forward in building community trust? Trust is actually the glue that binds a community with law enforcement or law enforcement with the community, and it doesn't happen randomly and it doesn't happen instantly. It's trust that must be cultivated through a relationship that law enforcement has with the community. So how do you build this trust? There are several different ways, and we're just going to briefly go over some of them, such as input, liaison, training, interaction, community events, and briefly on social media as well. But one of the other things you could do is take a look at what has worked previously for your agency or for your department that resulted in a very strong relationship with a particular section of the community. What was it about that that formed this relationship that was based on trust? When you're creating policy or practices, there are several different areas where you can get input that can really help you build a policy and practices that's going to best serve the community. When soliciting for the input, it can affect those either directly or indirectly. For example, advocacy groups can represent specific populations. You can reach out to, for example, a disability rights advocacy group to help you with developing your policy and your practices. For victim service providers, they do this on a day-to-day basis, and they have expertise and knowledge that they can share with the police department or with law enforcement to enhance the policies and practices that you're developing. As for faith-based organizations, reach out to the churches, the mosques, and the temples, and any other different organizations, because generally they are going to be holders of large sections of our communities. Those community members that you'll find, like in the faith-based organizations, who are the informal leaders within the community? There's usually someone within the community who doesn't necessarily have a political position or an appointed position, but they informally lead their community passionately oftentimes to get better service and better treatment for their particular community. Identify those specific community members. And victims and survivors, those are some of the best resources you can have in getting input on how to develop policy and practice that's really going to enhance and enable you to provide better and more distinct service to a particular community.
One of the things I'll just add to what Irene was saying is that really take an opportunity to do that survey or that census of your community to identify who some of these different organizations and groups are, and recognize they may not always be the traditional organizations that you have a relationship or perhaps serve on task force or collaborative bodies, and really think broadly and think outside of the box about who are those providers in your communities, even if they may not be recognized as an established provider or specifically serving a particular constituency or focusing on a specific issue like domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. We really want to engage in the efforts to have as many voices as possible inform our policy and practice, and giving us this routine feedback so that we can always be looking at adapting and making our processes and our programs as effective as possible. Irene mentioned earlier looking at opportunities to build and foster better relationships between populations and marginalized communities and law enforcement, and she discussed some of the different ways in which we can go about that. I think one of the things that we've seen is numerous jurisdictions across the country, law enforcement agencies have established specific liaison units or divisions that focus on doing exactly that partnership building, that relationship fostering with some of those communities. So for instance, in the District of Columbia, the Metropolitan Police Department has several liaison branches focused on different marginalized communities, including communities in which there has been some historic conflict between law enforcement and members of these communities, and the liaison branches were really a mechanism to try and better that relationship, ensure that members of communities have access to the services of law enforcement, and decrease some of those barriers that we already discussed. So in the District of Columbia, we have an Asian liaison unit, we have a deaf and hard of hearing liaison unit, a lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender liaison unit, and a Latino liaison unit. We strongly encourage law enforcement agencies that have units like these or divisions like these to really bring them into that conversation around your body-worn camera program. They often hear from members of the community, are collecting information, have the ear, and can be incredibly valuable in informing policy and practice. They also, because of the relationships they have in the communities, may be able to bring people to the table. So using your liaison branches or your dedicated division to really reach out to the community, both as a way to provide information and also gather that input that Irene was speaking about to really shape your policy and your practice. It's also really important to gather some information from the populations that you're serving around some of the training needs that they may recognize, that often we'll hear law enforcement is doing well in this area but could also benefit perhaps from some additional training. And when we're thinking about rolling out a new program like a body-worn camera program, training is absolutely critical. So as for jurisdictions that are in the process of implementing or just starting to implement a body-worn camera program, you want to be sure that as you roll out that program, there's training across the board. So all officers who will be wearing cameras need to be trained. Ideally, you'd like to train everyone in your agency if possible, civilian employees if that's applicable. Whenever you have new hires coming in, so if that's at the academy level, that they're being trained both on how the equipment itself works, what the protocols are, what the expectations are, and also understanding what happens with the footage. How does it become accessible? So really to having a sense of everything about the program. You also want to have those opportunities for ongoing training, particularly if there's any changes in the program, any technological upgrades, any adjustments that have been made, any lessons learned through feedback or evaluation about how can we do this more effectively. So wanting to have that training being both initial and ongoing. And when you're thinking about training, think about a variety of mechanisms to deliver that training. We know it can be really difficult to get everybody into a room together or to get a small group of folks into a room together for an hour or 2 hours. So while that may be feasible in some circumstances, you want to think about different methods. So what are you trying to accomplish with your training, and what may be some of the ways you can do this? So think about online training, which could be accessible anytime. This could be creating something in a webinar format similar to what we're doing right here. It could actually be an online training program that is developed that walks folks through what the protocol and procedures are, and also has that opportunity to do some knowledge testing. There could be small brief trainings during roll call to talk about discrete or concrete aspects of the program. Looking at those opportunities to do in-service training as well. And one of the things that can also be really beneficial is having trainings that are co-facilitated by law enforcement as well as community members, representatives of the very communities that we've been discussing. It's an opportunity not only for law enforcement to hear from members of those marginalized communities, but again, it's a way to build that trust and build that relationship by actually inviting representatives from those communities in to serve as the subject matter experts in their own experience, in their community's experience, and really, again, establish and foster those positive relationships between law enforcement and community members. And really taking advantage of any opportunity to enhance those interactions and finding those places to do both that individual as well as agency relationship building. So I'm going to turn it back over to Irene to explore a few more ways that law enforcement can actually interact and engage with the community.
Thank you, Michelle. One of the ways to improve community relations and enhance trust and encourage transparency is through officer and community interactions. Oftentimes, people within our communities don't necessarily know what law enforcement does. One of the best ways to introduce them to law enforcement is a Citizen Police Academy or a Youth Citizen Police Academy. That allows members of the community to do a mini version of what an officer would go through in the academy so that they have a better understanding of law enforcement, why certain actions are taken in particular incidences, and to have an open discussion about what's going on in their community at the same time. Because there is an aging population within our community, there's a lot of retirees. Volunteers in Police Service uses the knowledge and the experience of retirees from other entities to come to law enforcement and volunteer, whether it is something as simple as answering phones or participating in a community event with the police department. It goes a long way in having that officer and community interaction. Ride-alongs have always been something that has been of an interest to people in the community, and make that possible, make that a possible event that can occur. School resource officers are on a day-to-day basis in contact with the youth in the communities. Not only is this an opportunity to engage the youth and have conversations with them and to enhance the trust with the youth and law enforcement, but this is also an opportunity to reach the community through the youth. One of the ways is naturally through social media, and I want to come back to social media in just a bit. I want to look a little bit more at some of the community events. Some of the community events that you'll see, and you'll see these posted on social media, would be like town hall meetings or community forums. Neighborhood walks are a great way to get officers in their community walking with members of their community. It shows solidarity, it shows inclusiveness, and it shows transparency that we as law enforcement are members of the communities. Civic associations often host different events, and that's a great opportunity as well to interact with the community. You may have some community group hosted events. It could be a summer barbecue or block party in a particular neighborhood. That's also a wonderful opportunity for officers within law enforcement to interact with the community. Now, going back to social media, I kind of want to go over that just a little bit more. Traditional forms of communicating with the communities are pretty much obsolete. Now, for example, recruiting posters would be posted in libraries or at the station, and those really are just obsolete and ineffective. They're also not cost effective. With social media, law enforcement can connect with the communities for free, and you have different avenues you can do that, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. There's a whole bunch that you can choose from, and these are ways that you can communicate directly, one-on-one, and also with an entire community. So this social media can give you access to people in communities who may otherwise not be reached. One of the other important things with social media is if you have someone or people within your community who have a language barrier, they can still communicate with law enforcement through a social media site. Most social media sites have the ability to translate for free from the native language to English, so that that language access is not blocked. It's also a way for law enforcement to post information in multiple languages on their website or on Facebook, so that they can reach a larger audience and it not be limited because of language barriers.
Thanks, Irene. So we've talked about some of the considerations really around relationships, around practice, and we think it's important to look at what are our policies and what are our protocols and how do we develop those. In a survey that was done in 2016, 95% of law enforcement agencies across the country indicated that they had either already implemented body-worn camera programs or were considering implementing body-worn camera programs. And so for many of you viewing this, you either have a policy in place or you may be in the process of developing a policy or are considering developing a policy. So we want to look at some issues and considerations wherever you may be in that process. So for those jurisdictions that already have an existing policy, one of the things to look at is this policy that is mandated or that has elements that are prescribed by legislation that was enacted either on the local or state level. Is it guided in addition or entirely by internal policy? Those are important to think about because that affects really the way that you can update or change or adapt your existing policies. If they are completely internally crafted or developed policies, they're often much easier to make changes to respond to new and emerging information and needs than it is to go back and change legislation. If you have an existing policy already and you're finding that you're wanting to do some work with the identified marginalized or vulnerable populations in your community, whether that's because you're trying to engage in additional outreach or there is some dissatisfaction that you've identified, what is really important is to be transparent with community members, to talk about how was the policy or protocol developed, how was it crafted, what was the specific impetus if there was one, who was involved in that process, who had a voice in crafting that original policy. And I think it can also go a long way to admit when you didn't solicit the level of feedback or community input that could have been beneficial, and that now you're engaging with communities in order to try and take a new direction. So be very clear about what the process was, who had a role in that, what was the timeline around that, and really where you want to go moving forward with it. And part of that is to have concrete examples around how you will be soliciting input from members of the community. So thinking about different ways you want to do that, as some of the examples that Irene previously spoke about, those places where you can engage with the community, whether you will have more structured, specific ways. Do you have your policy for your body-worn camera program up on your website? Is there a feedback opportunity on that where community members can submit either anonymously or identified feedback about their experiences with officers wearing the cameras or with the program itself? Assess the efficacy, and we'll talk about evaluation and adaptation in a moment, but it is really important to look at, is the program achieving what it is that you hoped it would achieve? We talked about the benefits when we started, and there were numerous potential benefits. What were your agency's goals and objectives in implementing your body-worn camera program? What was it that you wanted to achieve, and are you achieving those goals? And if not, do you need to make either adjustments to those goals? Do you make adjustments to your policy or your protocol in order to better achieve those goals? For those agencies and jurisdictions that may be in the process of just developing a policy, thinking about specifically the marginalized and vulnerable populations that we've been discussing and really wanting to have them be part of the development process, identify who your community stakeholders are and who those representatives are. We know that we want to create a process that is inclusive and also is not overly burdensome. Many of us have been in the environment where you're creating protocol by group, and that's not always the most effective way to do it. So identifying who are your stakeholders and the different ways in which they can have that input, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have everybody in the room at the same time having that conversation, but there are different ways for that to happen. Collect the input, create a timeline to do that, create the mechanisms to do that, and make sure that you're advertising or marketing or pushing out the opportunities to these marginalized communities to provide that input. Thinking about the different ways that you can do that Irene talked about, using social media, using technology, really as much as you possibly can create those mechanisms for input to inform your process. Coordinate efforts. Perhaps there's already other efforts happening around different policy or protocol development within your agency, other programming that's happening. If there are task forces or coalitions that are doing work in your community or in your state, see if you can dovetail with some of those efforts. If there are already other bodies that are engaging effectively with the communities that you want to work with, see if you can build partnership around those efforts so that you're not asking communities that are often pressed upon to continue to give more and more. So really try and find those opportunities. And then look at best practices. The great thing about the fact that body-worn cameras have been implemented in so many jurisdictions across the country is that we are now creating this growing body of identified best practices. There's increasing research around the programs and their efficacy. So really there's not a need to recreate the wheel when you're thinking about developing and implementing one of these programs. And we're actually going to provide a number of resources around body-worn camera programs, development, research, resources at the end of this webinar. And so I mentioned ensuring that you're looking at the efficacy of your program and adjusting and making any adaptations as you go along. Evaluation is critical, and ideally for those jurisdictions that haven't yet developed your body-worn camera program, you want to build it in at the start. You want to have this be part of your planning conversations. You want to identify what is it that you're going to try and achieve with this program, and then how do you go about measuring whether you have achieved that or not. So what are the things that you want to see? What would the outcome of having this program be? Perhaps that's enhancing your investigations or enhanced prosecutions, an increase in the number of prosecutions. Maybe it's a decrease in the number of misconduct complaints against law enforcement, a reduction in negative interactions. Perhaps it's increasing the reporting rates amongst marginalized populations. So really thinking about what is it that you want to achieve and how might you go about measuring this to see if you're actually getting to the place that you want to be. For those agencies that already have body-worn camera programs in place, do you have an evaluation process? What are you doing? How are you collecting that feedback, and how are you looking at whether you're achieving what you set out to do? As part of this, include a mechanism to collect feedback from the community. We've already talked about this in the process of developing policy, but it's the same process for ongoing evaluation. You want to do this, and it's not just one time. It's going to be periodic, because as time changes, as technology changes, as communities change, we want to be continuously soliciting that input. Our focus really has been on vulnerable and marginalized populations, and so make sure that you are engaging in active efforts to solicit feedback from those communities. And it may actually require additional efforts because of the barriers and the challenges that we've already discussed. So whatever additional work you need to do to ensure that they have a voice in this process, engage in that. When you've identified if there are changes that need to be made, assess what is required to change that. Does it require legislative action? Work with your policymakers. have your policymakers be part of this process, making sure that you're collecting both their feedback, their viewpoints, the questions that they have, and that we're responsive to those questions, and creating our partnerships with our policymakers as well. And as I've discussed, it's not just once, it's an ongoing process. One of the things I would also recommend is looking at having a third-party evaluator, that it can be really beneficial. Well, one, there's often law enforcement agencies who don't necessarily have the in-house expertise around doing evaluation. So look at third-party evaluators, look at universities in your community, look at some of the national experts who have done this work. One of the things I'll say that in the District of Columbia, as we rolled out our body-worn camera program, we were able to engage with evaluators at the beginning, and were able to do a randomized control sample in how we distributed the body-worn cameras, and really are anticipating later this year releasing probably the most robust evaluation of body-worn camera programs that has been conducted to date. So really looking forward to getting that information and thinking about how it can further move us along in our protocols and our procedures, and so that we can further enhance the benefits of this program. But going back to that notion of a third-party evaluator, I think for some jurisdictions there's a little bit of hesitancy or concern around bringing in someone from outside of the agency to look at everything and look at all the data and look at all the information and then do that evaluation. But this is a practice that we're seeing more and more of, again, because in some cases the jurisdiction doesn't have that internal capacity, but also recognizing that having that expertise of an evaluator can really benefit us. And Irene, I think you have an example in your agency of how you have been using a third-party evaluator and some of the benefits of that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So my agency, we're actually working with a couple different academias, universities throughout the country, and the goal of this, it moves away from traditional training where an officer is put into the academy and they're trained, and then their skill set is measured against the performance guideline. And what we're doing is we're looking more at a problem-based learning strategy. So this is all through statistics and through measurements and a lot of social input. And so we partnered specifically with the University of Maryland, and they are conducting research. Now, their research is funded through the university. It has nothing to do with our agency, and that's one of the benefits that we also have. So not only are we getting professional academia research conducted on our policies and our processes, but we're also not having to spend any money to get this professional service. So I think just as body-worn cameras are advancing how we police and how we enforce laws, I think the way that our training and our actions and our performance, how that is evaluated and looked at, is also going to evolve. And I truly believe that academia is one of the best ways to establish that.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think it is really important, and when we think about evaluation, and specifically as we've been framing our discussion around vulnerable and marginalized populations, one of the considerations we also want to have is what capacity might a third-party evaluator have to be able to really solicit information and get the feedback in order to make any evaluation really be useful from those marginalized and vulnerable populations that we've been talking about. That'll be really critical for jurisdictions to think about in evaluating their evaluator, right? That if you have someone who has no experience or no expertise working, whether it's with a specific faith community or the GLBTQ community, with military communities, making sure that they're thinking through how do they solicit information, how do they solicit data, how do they collect the factors and the information that will be critical for having a really robust evaluation, particularly from those communities that we've been talking about. So when you're looking at your evaluation process, recognizing that all of the barriers that we have been discussing are also some of the same barriers that may make evaluation a little more difficult or challenging, and you're going to want to put some of those same efforts into place around that. So I think we've looked at a lot of different considerations around marginalized and vulnerable communities, and really thinking through, as we're implementing or refining our body-worn camera programs, wanting to recognize that both we know we have to have specific considerations when we're looking at victims. As we started out, we talked about how all of this has really grown out of the discussion we've been having around the intersection of body-worn cameras and victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, dating violence, human trafficking, but also then adding that additional level of looking at marginalized and vulnerable populations, and when victims are also members of those vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so there is a really critical piece here for us to be thinking about. And again, it's not something that you necessarily need to do in isolation, that there's a lot of work that has already been done, and that there are additional resources that we want to provide to you. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to talk about some of the national resources that are available.
We have some resources that can help and assist with the development of policies and programs. There's a few websites listed on the screen here that can help you. There's the deliberations document. There's also documents from some of our partner organizations that we work closely with that specifically address lethality assessment, domestic violence, sexual assault, that will present a lot of these issues that were discussed today. The IACP also has the model policy and concepts and issues paper on body-worn cameras, and BJA has a great toolkit online with a lot of resources, trainings, and information that can be of use. So thank you again. Bob, on the screen now you will see is our contact information here at the IACP. Please visit the website or call us if you have any questions about today's or this presented webinar discussion. Please send us an email or give us a call, and we will get you in touch with subject matter experts who can help with your development of policy and programs. Thank you.